Have you ever been looked at with suspicion, even when you did everything right? Imagine this. You step onto a plane, holding a first-class ticket you paid for with your own hard-earned money, but the flight attendant looks at you as if you've somehow stepped into the wrong world. This is the story of Danielle Moore, an African-American executive, on a Summit Airways flight from New York to Phoenix. She just wanted a few quiet hours before another demanding work week until Amanda Tate, the flight attendant in charge of first class, stopped by her seat, a polite smile, a comment as soft as a whisper. First class isn't what it used to be, and just like that, in a matter of moments, a quiet storm began. Dignity versus prejudice. If it were you, how would you react? Would you explode in anger or stay silent, letting the truth speak for itself? Only 7 minutes later, the balance of power would shift in a way no one could have predicted. Join me for the story of Silent Justice Danielle Moore's journey, where a single glance can shake an entire system. If you believe in the power of intelligence and dignity, hit like, share, and subscribe, and step with me into this story. The boarding gate of Summit Airways was more crowded than usual that morning. Passengers stood quietly in line, the light from the wide windows reflecting off the tiled floor mixing with the smell of coffee and the soft rolling of suitcase wheels. In the middle of that line was Danielle Moore, an African-American woman in her early 40s, dressed in a graceful gray suit. She walked slowly, holding her first-class ticket, one she'd earned with her own hard work. No one knew she had just wrapped up 3 exhausting days of presentations in New York and was on her way to Phoenix for another major project. All she wanted now was a few quiet hours to review her proposal. Tucked neatly in the dark brown leather bag slung over her shoulder, up ahead, a flight attendant was checking tickets. Amanda Tate. Blonde hair tied high, calm expression, but her eyes narrowed slightly each time a passenger handed her a ticket. When Danielle stepped forward, Amanda smiled that polished, professional smile, yet there was something in her eyes, thin, cold, and sharp, like the edge of a blade. "Ticket, please," Amanda said evenly, but her gaze didn't stay on the ticket. It lingered a second too long on Danielle's face. For a brief moment, the air between them went still. The light above glinted on the small nameplate that read A. Tate. Danielle handed over her ticket and gave a polite nod. Amanda glanced down at the ticket, then back up, as if trying to match something that didn't quite fit. She said nothing, just took a quiet breath and handed it back. Left aisle, seat 2A. She said polite enough, but missing something. Maybe acknowledgement, maybe respect. Danielle thanked her and stepped past the curtain into first class. The air was calm, the seats wide, the lights dim and warm. She set her bag down, opened her laptop, and was about to check her work schedule for the week. Then, from behind her, a murmur soft enough to sound offhand, but clear enough to cut first class isn't what it used to be. Danielle looked up. She didn't turn around, just stared at the dark screen in front of her, seeing her own reflection staring back, a face holding on to composure. She knew. That comment wasn't about the cabin. It was about her. She drew in a slow breath and quietly closed her laptop. Everything inside that plane looked peaceful, passengers fastening seat belts, attendants smiling, engines humming softly like a heartbeat. But underneath that calm, an invisible thread had just tightened thin, cold, ready to snap. Danielle knew if she let instinct take over, this conversation could turn into something else entirely, But she also knew that calmness was the strongest armor a black woman could wear in public. So she chose silence not as surrender, but as strength, a silence that waits for truth to reveal itself. A few passengers behind her exchanged glances. Some thought it was just a small misunderstanding. Others saw the look in Amanda's eyes and realized this wasn't accidental. Danielle simply adjusted her posture, as if realigning her place not just in the seat, but in the situation itself. Amanda turned away, greeting other passengers, but on her face lingered that thin smile, the kind of smile people wear when they believe order still belongs to them. She didn't know that within hours, that very order would collapse by her own doing. Danielle turned to the window. A gust of wind brushed against the plane's wing, trembling the glass ever so slightly. She closed her eyes. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't ever let anyone make you forget who you are." A faint smile crossed her lips. "No, I won't forget." The plane began to taxi toward the runway. Engines roared softly, the light outside blurred white like mist. In first class, everything appeared perfect, but perfection is fragile. Sometimes, all it takes is a glance or a single careless word to reveal the crack beneath it all. And, like the opening notes of a song, that moment planted the first seed of conflict, a tiny seed that would soon grow. And when it did, it would shake the very system that tried to contain it. Danielle exhaled slowly and opened her laptop again, typing a few short notes. Not about work this time, but about what she'd just felt. Maybe it was just a small story on a plane, or maybe it was the beginning of something much bigger. The plane lifted off the runway, climbing into the clouds, leaving everything small beneath it. But inside that first-class cabin, the air felt heavier. Amid polite laughter and the shimmer of wine glasses, Danielle began to realize not all storms come from the sky. Some come from the way people look at you. The Summit Airways plane began its slow roll toward the runway. Morning light spilled into the cabin, glinting off the glassware on the drink trays, wrapping the first-class cabin in a kind of artificial peace. But to Danielle Moore, that peace felt fragile, polished, yes, but strained, like a coat of varnish hiding the cracks on an old wall. Amanda Tate moved down the aisle, that trained smile still fixed in place, but her eyes had lost their neutrality. She stopped beside seat 2A, Danielle's seat, and tilted the tray slightly. "What would you like to drink? Ma'am, champagne? Or just water?" Her tone was polite, but there was a faint emphasis on the word just small, subtle, but enough to sound like an evaluation rather than an offer. Danielle smiled lightly. "Water's fine, thank you." Amanda nodded, poured the water. As she handed over the glass, her wrist turned just slightly enough for a drop to spill down onto Danielle's pants. "Oh, sorry about that," Amanda said quickly. Her voice carried habit, not regret. She reached for a napkin, then paused, didn't hand it over, and simply moved on. Danielle dabbed the spot herself with her own napkin. It was just water, not worth a scene. But that feeling, she knew it. It wasn't about the spill. It was about the test. The quiet little ways people measure how much you'll take before you speak up. The accidents that happen again and again, just to see if you'll flinch. Outside, the plane began to accelerate, wheels shivering against the tarmac. Inside Danielle's mind, a thought surfaced clear as glass. This isn't an accident. Amanda returned a moment later with a tray of snacks, chatting warmly with the two passengers up front. Her laugh rang easy and familiar, but when she passed Danielle again, she leaned slightly closer and murmured soft enough that only one person could hear. "Sometimes the system mixes up seats. But hey, maybe you got lucky this time." The words were light as air, but they stung all the same. Danielle didn't look up. She placed her hands on her knees and steadied her breath, holding it like a rope pulled taut. She knew this game. The subtle trials played by those who believe that to serve is to judge. From across the aisle, Richard Cole, a middle-aged businessman, glanced over. He said nothing, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty, that flicker of discomfort people get when they sense something's off, yet convince themselves it's just a misunderstanding. Like the countless times before, when injustice brushed past quietly, leaving no trace but a silence that felt complicit. Amanda returned to the galley, leaning toward her younger colleague, Chloe Park, who was setting up the meal trays. "Something's off with seat 2A, Amanda said, jotting something down in her notebook. "But her ticket clearly says first class," Chloe replied softly, hesitant. Amanda shrugged, a faint glint of satisfaction flickering across her face. "Yeah, I just want to be sure. You know, those cases do happen once in a while." That phrase, "those cases," didn't need explanation. They both knew what it meant. Only Amanda smiled. Danielle opened her laptop again, pretending to work, but her eyes drifted toward the reflection on the dark screen. She could see Amanda watching her from the galley, that cold, metallic stare. No loud words, no overt gestures, just a series of deliberate, repeated acts. That's what people call microaggressions, the cuts you can't see, but that bleed all the same. Her mind drifted back to another time, a hotel clerk once asking, "Are you sure you're staying at this hotel?" The words were always framed as questions, never accusations, yet somehow they still made you question yourself. Danielle leaned back, closed her eyes. Stay calm. Just stay calm. She knew too well react too quickly, and you'd only be called sensitive or defensive. She wouldn't let herself be cornered into that trap. Amanda came back again, this time with another tray of drinks for the row behind. She tilted her head, smiling to the other passengers as her heels clicked rhythmically against the carpet. To her, this was a small game, a way to remind the order of things. But she didn't know that the woman she was trying to provoke wasn't just another passenger. Danielle didn't need power to respond. She had something stronger: memory, composure, and witnesses who were beginning to notice. From the left side of the cabin, Ethan Reyes, a young passenger filming the view outside the window, unintentionally panned his camera through the first-class cabin. His lens caught the moment Amanda leaned in, smiling, and said, "We've got to maintain the standards of first class, don't we?" The line slipped effortlessly into the recording, a sentence that would later echo like prophecy for the storm ahead. Danielle opened her eyes, staring straight ahead. She didn't speak, didn't turn, but something in her expression shifted. Not anger, just recognition. She knew she was stepping into deeper waters now, where bias wasn't about one person, but about the structure that shaped them all. The plane kept rolling. Engines roared, wind pressed against the fuselage, and beneath the sound, Danielle whispered, quiet, resolute, for no one but herself, "All right. If she wants to test the line, I'll show her where it is." The plane reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign went off, and Amanda Tate re-entered the first-class cabin, poised and polished, but her eyes restless, like someone looking for an excuse to act. Danielle Moore, in seat 2A, sat still, calm, until the words came soft, almost courteous, yet cold enough to slice. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy." And that was the moment. Every mask began to fall. 15 minutes after takeoff. The seatbelt sign clicked off. The engines hummed steadily. The lights softened, and passengers began to open laptops, unfold newspapers, or close their eyes to rest. Everything in the first-class cabin of Summit Airways looked calm, but beneath that stillness, something was beginning to crack. Amanda Tate emerged from the front galley, holding a small clipboard. Her smile was the same polished one seen in airline commercials, but her eyes carried the look of someone about to enforce a rule. She stopped at seat 2A, where Danielle Moore sat quietly, headphones on, reviewing documents. "Excuse me, ma'am," Amanda said gently, her tone like a breeze. "There seems to be a seating error. It looks like your ticket doesn't match the updated manifest. I'll need you to move to economy while we sort this out." For most people, that might sound routine, but for Danielle, it was a challenge. She removed her headphones and looked up, composed. "I purchased this first-class ticket 3 weeks ago. It's been confirmed. You can double-check your system." Amanda pressed her lips together. "I understand. But sometimes the system reassigns seats automatically. Technical errors." She smiled. That kind of smile used to smooth things over the one that really means you don't belong here. Across the aisle, Richard Cole, a passenger in his late 50s, looked up. He'd once been a lawyer, and he recognized the tone immediately, that quiet, practiced way people disguise exclusion as procedure. Danielle closed her laptop, placed it neatly on the tray. "Thank you, but I don't believe there's any mistake. My ticket says first class, and I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." Her voice was calm, measured not a single sharp note, but it carried weight. Amanda stayed where she was, her smile tightening. "I'm just following protocol. Ma'am, someone else may be assigned to this seat. Then you should find that person," Danielle replied, her tone even. "I'll be right here where I'm supposed to be." A silence formed between them, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind that fills a room when truth and pretense collide. The hum of the engines, the clink of silverware from the front row all faded to a hush. Amanda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm just trying to avoid trouble. Don't make me call someone else." The words were soft, but they carried the edge of a threat. Danielle met her eyes. Her voice didn't tremble. "You should do what you think is right," she said, "and so will I." Then she turned back to her screen as if the conversation was over. No attitude, no defiance, just quiet certainty. And somehow, that calmness, that refusal to react, threw Amanda off balance. She turned sharply, her face flushed beneath the dim cabin light. From the galley, Chloe Park, the younger flight attendant, had seen it all. After a pause, she stepped closer, whispering, "She does have a valid ticket. I checked." Amanda's reply came low, tight. "Just do your part. I'll handle it." Danielle didn't hear the words, but she felt their weight in the air. She sat still, her posture steady, knowing now this wasn't about a technical error. It was a test of dignity. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Just tell the truth and stand your ground." That was exactly what she was doing. No one in the cabin spoke, but everyone watched. A few exchanged glances, uncertain, uncomfortable. Only Richard Cole leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "There's no mistake here. I can feel it." Amanda turned back, her tone stripped of its earlier sweetness. "Are you sure you want to make this a bigger issue?" Ma'am Danielle looked up, slow and deliberate. "I'm not making it a bigger issue," she said. "I'm simply sitting in the seat I paid for." Ordinary words, but in that quiet cabin, they landed like a bell tolling. Amanda said nothing more. She turned, walking briskly toward the front. The curtain swayed behind her, a pale divider between two worlds, one she was trying desperately to keep intact. Her shoulders stiff, her stride rigid, the look of someone caught between duty and a wounded sense of authority. Danielle watched her go, not angry, just quietly sad. Not for herself, but for the way people still believed they had the right to decide where someone else belonged. She exhaled, leaning back. Silence isn't easy. It takes more strength than arguing ever could. In the row behind, Ethan Reyes, the young man with the small camera, scrolled through his footage. In one clip, he saw Danielle calm, framed by the window light, and beside her, Amanda, tense behind her corporate smile. He didn't know why, but something in him said, "Keep this. It matters." The plane flew on. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same. A line had been drawn thin, invisible, and cold. Danielle gazed out the window. The clouds stretched like an endless sea below. She smiled faintly. "If they think I'll stay silent forever, they've forgotten that even silence has its limits." At the front galley, Amanda tapped into the cabin log on her device and typed a note. "Passenger in 2A, attitude concern." A small line of text, one that would soon set off a chain of events she could never control. Not 5 minutes later, Amanda returned to the first-class cabin, but this time, her voice had lost its professional polish. A single sentence was about to leave her lips, one she would later wish she could take back. A subtle remark, almost harmless on the surface, but powerful enough to turn the entire flight into a mirror reflecting everything society tries to hide. That was when justice began to stir. The first-class cabin was still quiet, but the quiet had changed. It wasn't the easy calm of a morning flight anymore. It was a thicker kind of silence, like the fog before a storm. Amanda Tate returned, her steps quicker than usual. She stopped at seat 2A, where Danielle Moore sat composed, eyes on the lines of text on her laptop screen. From a distance, it looked ordinary, a flight attendant and a passenger, but between them, an invisible cord was tightening with every breath. Amanda leaned in, lowering her voice, trying to keep it professional. "Ma'am, I double-checked with the team on the ground. It does look like a seating error, but it's also possible the system auto-prioritized a loyalty customer. You know how it is? Sometimes first class isn't for everyone." She put a small weight on the word everyone, almost unconscious, but that very unconscious choice betrayed a habit of bias worn smooth over time. Danielle lifted her gaze from the screen. No flash of anger, no sharp retort, just a look steady, understanding, and cold with sadness. "What is it you're trying to say?" "Amanda," she asked, voice even, no higher than before. Amanda stalled for a beat, still wearing that thin smile. "Oh, it's nothing. I'm just saying, sometimes there are people like you, who get lucky with upgrades." The words slipped out light as breath and hit the air heavy as stone. A few nearby passengers looked up. Richard Cole, the middle-aged man in seat 3B, turned, brows knitting. He'd heard it clearly. People like you, a phrase every American understands, especially those who lived through the dividing lines of the 1960s. Danielle set her laptop aside, turned to face Amanda. No flinching, no heat. People like me, she repeated, slow and deliberate. Do you mean people who work hard, buy a legitimate ticket, and expect to be treated like every other passenger? Amanda opened her mouth, searching for the right words and finding none. I didn't mean it that way. I was just... You didn't mean it that way, Danielle said, gently cutting in, her tone still calm. But you said it. And in the moment you said it, you believed you were right. The cabin seemed to set like cooling glass. No one interrupted, but everyone felt something important had just taken shape. Amanda bit her lip. I think you're misunderstanding. I'm only trying. Danielle tilted her head, eyes steady. You're trying to say I don't belong here. Aren't you? Amanda straightened, face flushing as she tried to hold her composure. I didn't say that. But you thought it, Danielle replied, gaze never leaving hers. Time paused. The only sounds were the steady engines outside and Amanda's quickened breath. Richard Cole lowered his newspaper and spoke. Unhurried, I heard every word. Ms. Tate, there's no other way to read that. Amanda turned, startled. I was just... No need to explain, Richard said, voice low and firm. I practice law. I know sometimes the problem isn't the words themselves, it's the attitude that rides with them. The cabin went still. Amanda's eyes flicked around, searching for an ally, but even Chloe Park, the young attendant in the galley, let her gaze fall away. Danielle remained seated. She didn't add to it, just dipped her head slightly toward Richard. A small, wordless thank you. The air thickened. Silence was no longer a shield, it was evidence. Amanda forced a smile. I apologize if my words were misunderstood, Danielle answered. Voice soft but clear. No, Amanda, you weren't misunderstood. You just showed me how you understand the world. The words closed like a door not slammed, but leaving the person on the other side standing in their own shadow. Amanda turned away, hands trembling. She felt control slipping not just over a passenger, but over her own reflection, the perfect, polite attendant who was always right. Now, under those watching eyes, she felt suddenly small. Danielle faced forward again, opened her laptop, as if nothing had happened. But Richard Cole kept watching, thoughtful. In the cabin's muted light, he saw a different strength in her, not in volume, but in the kind of composure that makes others examine themselves. A moment later, Chloe quietly set a fresh glass of water on Danielle's tray. No words, just an apologetic glance. Danielle accepted it with a small nod, up front. Amanda stood still, smoothing her uniform, struggling to recover her professional poise. But each step after that felt heavier, as if she were carrying something she couldn't put down shame. The room softened again, but no one really returned to their papers or conversations. They all sensed they'd witnessed something larger than a minor dispute, a small mirror held up to society, where power and prejudice revealed themselves in just a few words. Danielle sat quietly, eyes distant. There was no triumph in her, only a hush. The hush of someone who knows she chose correctly, no anger needed. Only simple words reflecting the truth. She told herself, this isn't a fight between two people. This is a conversation between dignity and habit. And once dignity holds its ground, habit begins to shake. Perhaps it would have ended there if not for the small glow of a phone light in the row behind. In the cabin's dim hush, Ethan Reyes, the young passenger, had started recording the moment Amanda came back. An unplanned act, but one that would shape the entire storm to come. Because once bias is recorded, it's no longer private between two people. It becomes a mirror the whole world can look into. The lights in the first-class cabin dimmed to a soft glow. Most passengers had settled in, some closing their eyes, the hum of the engines turning into a steady background rhythm. But behind the thin curtain separating first from coach, the silence carried a quiet whirl, the kind only one attentive person could sense. Ethan Reyes, seated in the first row of economy, couldn't shake off the phrase "people like you." He had seen Danielle Moore's reaction, no anger, no defensiveness, just a calm so precise it made him think. Something about it told him this moment needed to be preserved. He unlocked his phone, pretending to film the clouds outside, then slowly tilted the camera toward the narrow gap in the curtain. Through the dim light, he could make out Amanda talking to another flight attendant, Chloe Park. Amanda's voice was low, tense, trembling slightly, but still clinging to a tone of control. "Chloe, I need your help. The passenger in 2A, she's being difficult. I think she's showing a non-cooperative attitude." Chloe lowered her eyes, hesitation in her gaze. She had seen everything Amanda's forced smile. The words "people like you" that had frozen the air. I'm not sure there's a problem. "Amanda," she murmured. "She's just calm, that's all." Amanda gave a short, dry laugh, trying to reclaim authority. "Chloe, you're young. You don't get it yet. When someone starts acting too polite, that's when they're testing your boundaries. I can't have the first-class cabin lose order." From the narrow curtain gap, Ethan zoomed in, capturing Amanda's face clearly, her jaw tight, hands gripping the clipboard, the body language of someone afraid but pretending to be in control. Chloe stayed quiet for a moment, then turned away. She didn't agree, but she didn't object either. It was the silence of someone small, caught inside a system that teaches obedience before conscience. Amanda took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into first class. Her face appeared calm, but her breathing betrayed her. When she reached Danielle's seat, she paused, bending slightly, forcing a polite smile back onto her lips. "We're working to resolve your ticket issue. Ma'am, please cooperate. I'd hate to call someone else to intervene." Danielle looked up, her gaze soft but steady. "I am cooperating. Amanda, I just don't see any reason to leave the seat I legally purchased." Amanda froze for a second. In the still cabin, someone coughed. A few passengers looked over. They didn't yet know what was happening, but the air was thick with that quiet tension, the kind that forms when power and truth begin to collide. Richard Cole raised an eyebrow, leaning toward the man beside him. "She's right," he whispered. "This isn't about a seat anymore." Amanda glanced around, aware of the eyes now watching her. Somewhere in her training, instinct urged her to reassert control. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Please understand that." Danielle nodded slightly, voice low but firm. "Your job is to serve, Amanda, not to judge." The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't carry anger, but it hit like a gavel striking wood. For a moment, even the sound of the curtain swaying became audible. Ethan kept filming, his hand trembling slightly. He knew instinctively that what he was capturing was more than a disagreement. It was a moment of truth, the kind people often pretend not to see. His camera caught Amanda's forced smile, her eyes flickering with unease, and Danielle's calm face still composed, luminous in the soft window light. Every frame felt heavy, almost sacred. Back in the galley, Chloe stood frozen. She wanted to step forward to say something, anything, but her training echoed in her head. Do not interfere in sensitive interactions. Every issue has a designated authority, and she realized that very silence was how prejudice survives, one policy at a time. Amanda turned away again, escaping the space that now suffocated her. She thought she could still control the situation, maybe by proving the passenger was being disruptive. What she didn't know was that every gesture, every word, every flicker of her expression was being quietly recorded second by second, breath by breath. Danielle stayed still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But inside, she understood this wouldn't end with an apology, because the truth now had an eye watching, and it would remember everything. The plane trembled slightly, a soft jolt of turbulence. The cabin lights flickered, then steadied. Amanda returned once more, trying to regain her poise, but each step she took felt more defensive, each breath more shallow. The words she'd said, "people like you." First class isn't for everyone echoed in her head, no longer self-justifications, but accusations. Richard Cole quietly opened his phone, typing notes. He had a sense of where this was heading. He'd seen too many cases begin this way, small incidents. One person's pride, another's silence, and end with a reckoning. Justice, he knew, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just needs one person to look and another to record. Ethan adjusted the focus again, capturing Amanda leaning close to Chloe for the second time. Her voice was caught clearly this time. "She's becoming a problem. I'm reporting her to the captain. Be ready." The words were short, sharp, dripping with authority, and Ethan's camera caught every syllable. He stared at the screen, a chill creeping through him. Danielle remained calm, eyes fixed forward. She didn't need to hear what Amanda said she already knew. Something was being set in motion, but instead of reacting, she opened her laptop again and began typing a note. 09:47 a.m. Flight attendant Amanda Tate continues to apply pressure. Other passengers witnessing. I remain seated. Calm maintained. She wasn't documenting to complain, she was documenting to bear witness, to preserve each fragment of truth before the storm. 10 minutes later, Amanda left the first-class cabin, phone in hand, voice low but firm as she spoke into the intercom. Passengers nearby caught fragments, the words security and disturbance. Meanwhile, Danielle sat still, her fingers laced together, eyes distant. Outside, the sky stretched wide and flawless, but inside that cabin, a storm of power was forming, and this time, it wouldn't just test boundaries, it would expose them. About 10 minutes later, the fasten seatbelt sign blinked back on. The air in first class had changed. No one spoke. Those who were laughing earlier now just exchanged quiet glances, as if waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Outside, the sky was calm, the plane steady, but inside the cabin a storm of power was gathering. Amanda Tate returned, holding the intercom phone. Her face had lost the polite calm she'd worn earlier. Behind her, Chloe Park followed hesitantly, eyes uneasy. Amanda stopped in the narrow aisle, voice sharp and controlled. "Ma'am, I need your immediate cooperation. If you continue to refuse, I'll have to call airport security to meet us upon landing." Danielle Moore, seated in 2A, didn't move. Her hands rested on her lap, head slightly tilted. The cabin light caught her face at an angle half illuminated, half in shadow, as if it were divided between restraint and the edge of defiance. She spoke softly, voice calm but cutting clear through the silence. "You're calling security because I'm sitting in the seat I paid for," Amanda replied instantly, without thought. "Because you're being disruptive, ma'am." Danielle raised an eyebrow, slowly closing her laptop and setting it aside. "Could you specify which part of my behavior you consider disruptive?" Amanda hesitated, then looked away. "Your attitude, ma'am. I'm just doing my job. You're making it difficult." Danielle looked up, meeting her gaze. Her tone stayed even, her words deliberate enough that every passenger could hear. "You're abusing your authority." "Amanda, I know my passenger rights, and I have clear evidence of what's been happening. If you truly believe calling security is necessary, go ahead. My lawyer will be very interested to review the footage from the passenger sitting behind us." The last line came out like air light, almost gentle, but it landed in the cabin like metal. Amanda froze. Behind her, Ethan Reyes, still recording, slowly lowered his phone, half in awe, half in disbelief. Richard Cole, the older man in seat 3B, leaned back and murmured, "The board just turned." Amanda tried to steady her tone, but her composure was cracking. "Are you threatening me?" Ma'am Danielle replied evenly, her eyes steady. "I'm reminding you of the consequences of your actions." A long silence followed. Chloe Park stood beside Amanda, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the floor. She knew Amanda was crossing a line, but also knew that, in systems like these, the one who's wrong often gets protected first. Amanda took a slow breath, forcing a smile, voice softening. "Ma'am, I don't want this to go any further. Let's just resolve it quickly." "Okay." Danielle tilted her head slightly, her tone kind but unwavering. "No one wants it to go further. Amanda, I just want to be treated fairly like every other passenger. Can you do that, or should I speak to your company's legal department when we land?" Her words weren't loud, but they carried the gravity of something official, a quiet warning. Everyone in the cabin felt it the shift. The difficult passenger had just become the one holding the moral ground. Amanda's breath quickened. She looked around, catching Richard's watchful eyes, and the faint reflection of Ethan's phone camera through the curtain. In that instant, she realized every movement, every word from now on, would be evidence. She swallowed hard. "I'll check with the captain." "You should," Danielle said evenly, "and remind him that Summit Airways signed an anti-discrimination compliance policy. I can quote it if you'd like." Another silence, but this time, it wasn't oppressive. It was transitional. One side was starting to lose its authority, the other no longer needed to fight for it. Amanda turned and walked away, her steps faster, like someone trying to outrun her own mistake. As she passed Chloe, she muttered under her breath, "Stay with her. Don't let her do anything unusual." Chloe didn't respond. She nodded faintly. But inside, she knew the only thing unusual here was Amanda herself. Danielle leaned back into her seat, exhaling slowly. She could feel the weight of the cabin's eyes, but there was no shame, no anger. In that dim light, she realized what she had always believed. Real strength doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from mastering your pain without letting it distort your dignity. Ethan turned off his camera, resting the phone on his knee. He whispered to himself, "She's rewriting the way people confront injustice." At the front of the cabin, Amanda stood beside the intercom, breathing unevenly. Her voice shook slightly as she pressed the button. "Captain Keller, I have a non-compliant passenger in 2A. Yes, the black woman. I think you should come take a look." The words were small, but they echoed inside her like a blade because even she wasn't sure anymore if she was still right. Meanwhile, Danielle tilted her head, thinking to herself, if they want to turn dignity into defiance, then I'll let the law define the difference. She opened her laptop and began typing carefully. 10:05 a.m. Lead attendant threatens to call security. I remained calm. At least 2 witnesses present. If necessary, I'll cite Department of Transportation Regulation 382. She paused, looking out the window. The Arizona sky was beginning to stretch into view, vast, blue, silent. It reminded her of her mother, of generations who had endured without being heard. She whispered softly, "I won't shout. Mama, I'll let the truth do it for me." 5 minutes later, the front curtain parted. A middle-aged man in a captain's uniform stepped out, Captain Thomas Keller. He looked around the cabin, his expression tired but stern, his eyes finally landing on Danielle Moore. Behind him stood Amanda, spine stiff, trying to hide her unease, and in that instant, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath because everyone understood justice had just boarded this flight. The thin curtain at the front of the cabin parted. A tall, middle-aged man with silvering hair stepped out. His uniform was crisp, the silver wings bright under the lights. Captain Thomas Keller, the pilot in command. His face carried the calm of a man seasoned by years in the air. But behind his eyes was the tired look of someone pulled from the cockpit for something that shouldn't need him. He stopped at seat 2A, glancing briefly at Amanda Tate, who stood unnaturally straight, a strained smile fixed in place. "What's going on?" "Tate?" he asked, low and steady, the tone of someone used to hearing reports, not arguments. Amanda drew a breath and answered quickly. "Captain, this passenger, she isn't complying with my instructions. I asked her to temporarily move to the lower cabin due to a seating error, and she refused. Her attitude has been non-cooperative." "Seating error," Captain Keller repeated, his eyes still on Danielle. Danielle Moore remained seated, hands folded, voice soft but clear, "Sir. I haven't shown any attitude. I'm sitting in the seat I purchased, staying calm and waiting for the airline to explain. And if the cabin audio's rolling, I'm confident this so-called non-cooperation will speak for itself." A short silence rippled out between the 3 of them. The engine's hum seemed louder, punctuating the tension in the room. From row 3B, Richard Cole leaned forward, his voice steady. "I can confirm that. Captain, she's been completely calm from the start. I'm seated right behind her. I heard every word. There's nothing here that qualifies as disruptive." A beat later, another voice, a woman's, rose from seat 1C. Margaret Hill, an older passenger, spoke slowly, her voice husky but firm. "I can confirm that as well. The attendant has singled her out repeatedly. I'm not saying it was intentional, but the phrasing, the looks, everyone could see it. First class fell absolutely still. It was no longer about a seat. It had become a test of conscience." Captain Keller looked to Amanda. She stood rigid, trying for poise, but her eyes slipped away, her strain hard to hide. He inhaled, then turned back to Danielle. "Ma'am, I understand this is uncomfortable, but for the sake of order in the cabin, I'm asking if you could temporarily move to a seat in the main cabin. The airline will clarify everything upon landing." He said it carefully, polite, smooth, even with a faint smile. But the very way he asked made the air grow heavier. Danielle studied him a moment. In her gaze was something deeper than disappointment, a clear recognition that even those representing the system often choose quiet over justice. "You're asking me to leave the seat I paid for to protect the quiet of this cabin, aren't you?" she said, calm voice, words dropping like stones. Captain Keller faltered a fraction, then held his line. "Sometimes, for the greater good, we take a small step back. I assure you, you'll have a full explanation once we land." Danielle nodded faintly, a small, sad smile without bitterness. "The greater good," she repeated. It's a familiar phrase. It's been used many times in history to persuade people to be silent. A few passengers lowered their heads. Margaret Hill gripped her armrest, eyes shining. Richard Cole looked down, said nothing, and slowly shook his head. Beside them, Amanda stood trying to conceal the lift of a private victory. But even she felt no real relief. Danielle's gaze calm, composed, was not the look of someone defeated. It was the look of someone recording everything: words, faces, and the shape of the moment. Danielle rose, no complaint, no accusatory glance. She gathered her laptop and bag, then turned to Captain Keller. "Very well, Captain, I'll go. But you should know I believe my attorney will be very interested in how you define cabin order." There was no threat in it, no anger, just a quiet reminder, the kind delivered by someone who doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Captain Keller stiffened for a beat, but said nothing. He stepped aside, making way. Danielle walked past him, back straight, steps measured and sure. From behind the curtain, Ethan Reyes kept filming, capturing the entire moment. In his small screen, a black woman stood and left her first-class seat not because she was wrong, but because she chose not to let anger take her freedom. As Danielle moved past Amanda Tate, their eyes met. Amanda pressed her lips together, trying to look composed, but Danielle's gaze made her glance down on instinct. Not out of fear, out of shame. Danielle spoke quietly, just loud enough for those nearby. "You don't need to teach me how to keep order, Amanda. You just need to learn how to keep dignity." She walked on, leaving behind a first-class cabin that had gone perfectly still, where privilege suddenly made the wide seats feel tight, the air hard to breathe. At the border between the two cabins, Danielle paused, looking toward the narrower row where she was headed. For a moment, the light from the window touched her face, no longer sad, simply steady. She understood sometimes to make justice audible. You step down so people can see who's been standing above. When Danielle took her seat in the middle of the main cabin, a few passengers turned to look. Some eyes held shame, others respect. But among them, another light glowed Ethan Reyes. He bent over his phone, replaying what he'd filmed Danielle walking, back straight. The silver gray of her jacket caught by the light. It wasn't just a moment of unfair treatment. It was the image of silent justice the moment truth began to speak in its own voice. The space between first class and the main cabin always carried a strange kind of light, neither as bright as the front, nor as dim as the back. A thin curtain divided two worlds, one where wine was poured into crystal glasses, and one where people tucked their knees so they wouldn't spill water. And now, Danielle Moore stood right at that border. Her posture remained upright, the brown leather bag slung neatly over her shoulder. Every passenger watched in silence. Some looked uneasy. Some lowered their heads. They didn't quite know what to feel: pity, guilt, or admiration. At the front, Amanda Tate stood poised, face tight, trying to project calm. Beside her was Captain Thomas Keller, the man who'd just made the for the sake of order decision. His gaze toward Danielle was a mix of pleading and relief, as though he believed this matter was finally being resolved peacefully. But justice is never resolved peacefully. It only grows quiet before it begins to speak louder. Danielle stopped before the curtain and turned around. The cabin lights caught her face, half serenity, half strength, the look of someone who had been wronged but refused to let anger define her. She spoke slowly, her voice not loud, yet every word rang clear. "This isn't over." The sentence was short, no threat, no bitterness, but it landed like truth itself. The air thickened. No one dared breathe too hard. Then, from the rows behind, a young man's voice rang out firm and certain. "Everything's been recorded." Every head turned. Ethan Reyes was standing, phone still in hand, camera pointed forward. The light from his screen illuminated his face, casting a glow into the quiet, fearful dark of the cabin. Amanda spun around, startled. Her voice trembled. "You're not allowed to film on this flight," Ethan answered, steady and resolute when someone's treated unfairly. Witnessing stops being a choice, it becomes a responsibility. A few passengers nodded. A quiet ripple spread, unspoken but undeniable. This was no longer about a seat. It was the moment a black woman was being forced from her place and the world was watching. Danielle looked toward Ethan, eyes full of gratitude. She didn't smile, just a small nod, silent, yet profound. Then she stepped through the curtain. The fabric swayed gently behind her, like the closing of one act and the quiet rise of another. Justice shifting scenes. Behind the curtain, the space felt smaller, seats packed close, lights dim and yellow. A young attendant guided her to an open spot near the back. Danielle set down her bag and sat. The seat was stiff, legroom tight, but she didn't show discomfort. From her bag, she pulled a small notebook, the same one she carried on every business trip. She opened it, uncapped her pen, and began to write. Not with emotion, but with precision, noting time, words, and actions, like a journalist chronicling the anatomy of injustice. 10:23 a.m., left first class seat as instructed for cabin order, Captain Thomas Keller, Attendant Amanda Tate, witnesses Richard Cole, Margaret Hill, Ethan Reyes recorded video. I remained calm. No reaction, no verbal aggression. Her hand didn't tremble. Her strokes were slow but firm. She knew from here on, every line she wrote was evidence, not just for her, but for every person who had endured something like this in silence. Up front in first class. Margaret Hill gripped her armrest, eyes glassy. She whispered to Richard Cole, "I should have stood up." Said something. Richard shook his head. "You'll have your chance when we land." In the back, Ethan Reyes kept filming. He captured Danielle sitting still, head slightly bowed, writing in her notebook. No tears, no rage, just stillness, resilient, dignified. A perfect portrait of silent justice. Amanda passed down the aisle, her eyes flicking briefly toward the back. She caught a glimpse of Danielle writing, then quickly looked away. But in that moment, The confident smile she'd worn all day dissolved. What replaced it was fear, not fear of being sued, but of the truth escaping her control. Danielle kept writing. Sometimes she paused. Glancing out the window, the sky streaked blue and white, calm and endless. Something in that light reminded her of her mother, the woman who once told her, "Not everyone who shouts the loudest is right. You just stand firm, and the world will learn to listen." She smiled faintly. "Mom, I'm still standing even while sitting here." The plane sped southwest through thin layers of cloud, somewhere in the cabin. Whispers began quiet, tentative, but aware. She didn't deserve that. Is that guy really recording? This is going to make the news. And just like that, the seed of justice began to grow silently, but spreading. Danielle finished her last line, closed the notebook, and set the pen on its cover. She didn't need to think anymore. The truth was already in motion beyond her hands now, and that realization brought a strange calm. Because she knew once truth is recorded, it always finds its way. She leaned back, eyes closed, not to sleep but to listen, to the hum of the engines, the rhythm of her own heartbeat, and the silence of dozens of people processing what they'd just witnessed. At the front, Amanda still couldn't shake the unease. She stood near the galley wall, eyes flicking toward the back again. In her gut, a feeling settled this wasn't over, and she was right, because hours later, when the plane touched the ground, her world would turn upside down. When the curtain between first class and the main cabin closed, first still looked luxurious half-drunk champagne flutes, linen perfectly folded, but the air had changed. The silence was no longer the quiet of comfort. It was the heavy hush of guilt that hadn't yet been named. Amanda Tate stood near the galley, straightening her uniform, trying to hold a professional frame, but every movement felt clumsy now. Her hand trembled as she poured water, her eyes kept darting, checking who was watching, and, as her instincts warned, someone was. Margaret Hill, the silver-haired woman in seat 1C, sat upright, fingers laced in her lap. She no longer stared out the window. Her gaze fixed on Amanda, calm, but carrying a certain authority, the authority of years, of lived justice. She spoke, voice husky, clear enough to make nearby passengers flinch. And, "Tate, do you realize you just humiliated a woman because she doesn't look like the others in this cabin?" Amanda froze, turned, and forced a smile. "Ma'am, I was simply following company policy. There was no discrimination." Margaret tilted her head, eyes steady. "No discrimination. I've flown this airline for 10 years. I've never once seen a seat mix-up in first class. Funny, isn't it, that today the mix-up happened to the only black woman in the cabin? Don't you find that coincidence a little tiresome?" The question was gentle but carried far. A younger man in seat 2B, who'd been quiet, slowly set his glass down. "She's right," he added. "From the start, I saw you scrutinize her more than anyone else. I think the airline should review how its staff treats people." Amanda drew a breath. The color drained from her face. She glanced around and found many eyes on her now. Not angry eyes, awakened ones. Eyes that had begun to understand something was wrong. A middle-aged woman murmured. Buried in a sigh, "I've never seen anyone treated like that." And all because she stayed calm. Whispers rolled outward, soft but heavy enough to weigh down first class. Amanda's throat went dry. She tried to turn away and directly met the lens of a phone. Richard Cole held it plainly on the table. camera still open. A chill traced her spine. She heard again the words Ethan Reyes had thrown from behind the curtain. Everything's been recorded. Now it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a quiet verdict. Amanda forced a thin smile, reaching for her professional tone. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand tensions are high, but please trust the airline will review this matter. For now, let's remain calm so the flight stays safe. Calm, Margaret repeated, sharper. You're asking us to be calm after you publicly humiliated a woman. Do you know what angers people even more than prejudice? When the person who caused it tells the victim to calm down. Amanda opened her mouth and nothing came out. A long moment passed, long enough for everyone to feel that power had shifted. No one shouted, no one called for her firing, but the silence was worse than scolding. It forced Amanda to face her own reflection, multiplied in a dozen watching eyes. She turned and hurried toward the galley. As she rounded the corner, a soft ping sounded from her pocket, a crew chat notification. She glanced at the screen, hoping for some operational note. Instead, a message from an unknown sender. You should stop lying. Amanda, everyone saw it, and it's all on video. She went rigid, heart racing. Who sent it? A passenger. A colleague was the airline itself watching. In that instant, Amanda felt something she'd never truly felt, fear of the public, fear of the light. She realized the small power she'd relied on to teach order was now reflecting back, exposing her own fragility. In the back cabin, Danielle Moore kept writing in her notebook. She didn't know that in first class, those who'd been silent were beginning to speak on her behalf. But she felt it intuitively. The atmosphere on the plane had changed. Her phone vibrated softly. An anonymous text. I've got everything on video. Don't worry. You did the right thing. Danielle looked at the screen and smiled faintly. It didn't matter whether it was Ethan, Richard, or Margaret. What mattered was this. The truth had found allies. She closed her phone, leaned back, and exhaled. In the cabin's gentle light, her composure moved the woman beside her, a young mother, to rest a hand on Danielle's shoulder, a wordless gesture of solidarity. On the other side of the curtain, Amanda stood motionless, eyes on the floor. She heard the passengers' murmurs, the chime for upcoming meal service, and the dry crackle of her pride crumbling inch by inch. No one spoke to her in the polite tone of valued customers anymore. No smiles met her greetings. Her power hadn't been taken, it had dissolved, because it was built on a wrong up front in the cockpit. Captain Keller heard a note from the internal system. Captain, there's reaction in first class. Passengers are discussing the incident with 2A. He closed his eyes briefly and drew a breath. He understood that his for the sake of order decision might become a media storm on landing. As the plane began its descent, first class remained quiet, but no one felt comfortable. Behind the curtain, Danielle opened her eyes, watching sunlight rake across the wing like a reminder that justice may fly slowly, but it always reaches its destination. Up front, Amanda Tate looked into the tiny galley mirror, seeing herself a tight face, a forced smile, and wondered, for the first time, if there hadn't been a camera today, would I have seen who I've become? Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. 11:47 The airplane door hissed open, and the dry, searing Arizona air rushed in, carrying with it the restless heartbeat of those who had just lived through an uneasy flight. Danielle Moore was among the last to stand. She waited for the others to leave first, then stepped forward calmly, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. Outside, passengers began to scatter, yet her name, Danielle, lingered on a few lips. She didn't know it yet, but within minutes, her story would no longer be an incident on a flight. It would become a wave sweeping across America. A few steps behind her, Ethan Reyes clutched his phone, hands trembling, but eyes sharp with purpose. He had just uploaded a 4-minute video, the full scene of Amanda Tate ordering Danielle to leave first class, with Margaret Hill and Richard Cole testifying in her defense. His caption was just 2 words. Flying while black, he pressed post. Within 30 seconds, the clip was already spreading. A passenger nearby glanced at their feed. The video had appeared in their timeline. From there, it took flight through Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube Shorts, where thousands began to comment, share, and rage. At the jet bridge, a small group of Summit Airways staff stood waiting, forced smiles, name tags polished, hands clasped. But to the passengers walking past, those uniforms no longer symbolized professionalism. They looked like a system trembling under the weight of truth. A local reporter from Phoenix News Now appeared, microphone in hand, voice brisk and eager. "Ma'am, I'm Mariah Jenkins. Were you the passenger asked to leave first class? Can you tell us what happened?" Danielle paused. There was hesitation in her eyes, not from fear, but from understanding. Once she spoke, nothing would ever be the same. Then she saw them, Margaret's eyes, Ethan's eyes, and the silent eyes of dozens waiting for justice to be spoken aloud. She inhaled slowly, then said clearly, each word deliberate. What happened today wasn't just about a seat. It's about how old prejudices still find their way into places that call themselves civilized. I'm not looking for compensation. I just want people to understand sometimes. You can be asked to leave your place not because you did something wrong, but because you don't fit someone's idea of who belongs there. The statement was captured in full, a 40-second clip that spread even faster than the original video. Meanwhile, Amanda Tate exited the plane, trying to dodge cameras. She wore a cap and dark glasses, but Ethan was waiting near the gate. He didn't look angry, only steady, composed, with his camera raised. "Ms. Tate," he said, voice calm but cutting through the noise. "Do you have anything to say about forcing a black passenger out of her first-class seat?" Amanda froze. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted, searching for an escape. Another reporter stepped closer. Mic extended. "Would you like to apologize to that passenger?" Amanda stammered. I'm not allowed to comment." No comment. Ethan lowered his phone, lens still pointed. His tone dropped, quiet but distinct enough for every microphone nearby. Sometimes silence is a statement. That evening, the no-comment clip was merged with the viral Don's Flying While Black video and broadcast across evening news networks nationwide. The footage of Danielle rising from her seat, her calm gaze, her words. "This isn't over" replayed on dozens of channels. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram exploded. Hashtags spread like wildfire. "Dear Justice in the Sky," "You're Flying While Black," "Dear Summit Scandal." People shared, debated, demanded answers. One former Summit employee commented Amanda Tate was reported before for similar behavior. "I filed a complaint, nothing was done." 20,000 likes in under an hour. In her small Phoenix apartment, Danielle sat before the TV, watching her own face on the evening news. She didn't smile, she just watched in silence. Her phone buzzed nonstop notifications, messages, calls from friends, colleagues, and strangers thanking her for not staying silent. Among the flood of texts was one name that stood out: Marcus Reed, a prominent civil rights attorney. His message was simple: "If you're ready, I believe we can do something bigger for everyone who's ever been silenced." Danielle read it twice. Then she looked out the window. The Phoenix sun bathed the city in gold, but this light felt different. It carried change not just for her, but for an entire system that had gone too long unchallenged. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "Maybe this is just the beginning." That night, Summit Airways released a hasty press statement. "We are conducting an internal review regarding an incident on Flight 482 from New York to Phoenix. We sincerely apologize for any unpleasant experience our passengers may have had." The statement spread quickly and was met with skepticism. Underneath, thousands of replies flooded in. "It's not an incident. It's a system problem." And they were right. The next morning, at Summit Airways Atlanta headquarters, the company held a press conference. Outside, reporters gathered shoulder to shoulder. Civil rights groups arrived with banners. The largest one read, "Don't just apologize, change." Meanwhile, in her small Phoenix apartment, Danielle sat by the window, phone in hand. It rang again. Marcus Reed calling. His voice was calm but firm. "Moore, are you ready? This isn't just your story anymore. It's time to hold them accountable." Danielle closed her eyes, breathing in deeply. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed bright. She answered softly, but with absolute resolve. "I'm ready." The next morning, America woke to a storm named Mach Flying While Black. From morning news on CNN to heated panels on Fox and MSNBC, the face of Danielle Moore, the black woman asked to leave her first-class seat, filled every screen in the country. Meanwhile, at Summit Airways Atlanta headquarters, the lights on the 12th floor meeting room had burned all night. Vanessa Harper, Summit's senior communications director, stood before a wall-sized display of headlines. Her voice was low, but tight as a wire. "We've lost control of the narrative. The video's gone viral across 42 states in under 18 hours. Civil rights organizations are contacting us. Investors want answers." Beside her, Captain Thomas Keller, the pilot from that fateful flight, sat motionless, fingers interlocked. He avoided looking at the screen where Amanda Tate's face appeared under a red headline, "Flight Attendant Forces Black Woman Out of First-Class Airline Stays Silent." The air in the room was thick, heavy. Every person there could feel the weight of the silence they themselves had created on that flight. Vanessa exhaled sharply, turning to her crisis advisors. "We respond immediately." She ordered a neutral statement. "Say the airline is conducting an internal investigation and emphasize our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. It needs to go out within 30 minutes. A young PR associate hesitated. "What about Amanda Tate?" Vanessa's tone went cold. "Silence, if necessary. We'll temporarily suspend her to protect the company's image. She's not the center of this crisis, Summit is." The room went dead quiet. They all knew what that meant. In corporate language, temporary suspension was a polite way to say sacrificial scapegoat. Meanwhile, in her small Phoenix apartment, Danielle sat by the window, her tea long cold. Her phone buzzed nonstop interview requests, messages of support, thank you notes from strangers, On the TV, a Summit Airways spokesperson read the statement Vanessa had just approved. "We regret the incident on Flight 482. The airline is conducting a full investigation and will cooperate with all relevant parties to ensure fairness for all passengers." Danielle watched, her expression calm, a tired, knowing smile playing at her lips. She'd heard that tone before. Full investigation was corporate code for buying time. She'd sat in too many boardrooms where mistakes were polished into policy reviews. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Marcus Reed. "They've opened an investigation, which means they're counting down to pick their scapegoat. Get ready, Danielle. Things are about to blow wide open." That afternoon, a new name burst onto the internet. Maria Gomez, a former Summit Airways flight attendant. She uploaded a 7-minute TikTok video, opening with "I used to work for Summit. I witnessed Amanda Tate humiliate a black passenger last year. I reported it, and nothing happened. They told me, don't make it a big deal." Maria shared receipts, internal emails, complaint reports, even a text from a manager warning her not to hurt the company brand. Her video spread faster than Ethan's original clip. Thousands commented. Other former employees began speaking out. "I've seen this kind of discrimination. She's not the first." Summit always knew they just stayed quiet. The storm was no longer about one person. It had become about the system. At headquarters, Vanessa Harper received her third crisis alert of the day. Maria's post had surpassed 3 million views. The brand monitoring dashboard flashed red negativity level critical. A senior executive slammed the table. "We have to act now. Fire Amanda Tate, release a separate statement, make her the face of the violation, cut the infection, save the body." Vanessa closed her eyes briefly and sighed. She knew it was the easiest move and the most cowardly, but Summit had no other choice. 3 hours later, Summit Airways issued a second statement. Summit Airways has terminated the employment of flight attendant Amanda Tate, involved in the incident on Flight 482. We apologize to passenger Danielle Moore and reaffirm our commitment to fairness and respect for all travelers. Underneath the post, comments flooded in classic scapegoating. They're not protecting customers. They're protecting the brand. Firing one person won't fix a system. Meanwhile, Amanda Tate, now officially unemployed, sat alone in her small Atlanta apartment. Her name flashed across every channel. She felt shattered, but not entirely wronged. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't just the price of one mistake. It was the cost of an attitude she'd carried for far too long. Late that night, Marcus called Danielle. "You see what they did? One sacrifice to save 100 suits. But we're not letting them wash their hands that easily. Are you ready to take this to court?" Danielle was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Marcus, I don't need to win for myself. I just need to make sure they can't do this to anyone else again." Marcus smiled over the phone. "Then we'll make them prove their fairness not with apologies, but with the law." That same night, a photo began circulating online. Danielle, framed in the glow of her window, tea in hand, gazing out over the city. The caption beneath read, "They can remove her from first class, but not from what's right." It wasn't an official photo, just a shot taken quietly by a neighbor, yet it became the emblem of silent justice. The next morning, as the news reported Amanda Tate's firing, new hashtags began to appear across major cities. "Yes, Justice Forward," a campaign launched by civil rights groups to support victims of discrimination across the service industry. Amid the rising tide, Marcus Reed called Danielle again, Ms. Moore. They're inviting you to speak at the movement's launch event. This is your chance to turn one injustice into a voice for thousands. Danielle looked out the window, where the Phoenix sunrise glowed across the sky. She said quietly, "All right, if justice can begin on a flight, maybe it's time it truly takes off." A quiet Phoenix morning. Honeygold sunlight poured over palm-lined streets. Inside a small apartment, Danielle Moore sat at her table, laptop open to a draft email, the subject line blinking, "Meeting with Marcus Reed, strategy outline," on screen. Marcus appeared over video call, the same steady, resonant voice as always, but today with a hint of emotion. "Danielle," he said, "they'll call in a few hours. Summit wants to settle. The figure could be big, very big. But it comes with an NDA. If you sign, you can never speak about this again. Ever." Danielle sat still. She didn't need to ask how much. Money had never been the answer to what happened. She smiled slightly, her voice small but sure. "Marcus, I don't want to be paid to be quiet. I want to speak for everyone who's ever been forced to be silent." On the other end, Marcus nodded softly. He knew she'd decided even before he said a word. He also knew that choice would make everything harder and might, just might, change history. 3 hours later, at Summit Airways headquarters in Atlanta, Vanessa Harper entered the conference room, her face calmer than usual. Beside her sat the airline's legal team. They had prepared a 13-page settlement agreement. The offer set at $400,000 with an airtight confidentiality clause. Vanessa held the printout, her tone composed but edged with fatigue. "We want to close this peacefully. Ms. Moore, no one wants a lingering wound. The airline is prepared to take responsibility as long as you agree to keep this confidential. Then we can all move forward." Across the table, Danielle listened closely. She looked at Vanessa, the woman who'd orchestrated Amanda's firing, to cut the flames with no rancor in her eyes, only clarity. "Ms. Harper," Danielle said, slow and even, "I've already moved forward, but not by burying this." Vanessa hesitated. "What is it you want?" Danielle didn't waver. "I want Summit to change its hiring policies, retrain the entire flight crew in cultural competency, and issue a public apology across national media. Not for me, for everyone who's been treated the way I was." The room fell. A counsel whispered, "She doesn't want money." Vanessa understood, and that scared her more than anything, because the person who can't be bought is the person you can't control. Meanwhile, in New York, inside the glass offices of Justice Forward, 3 co-founders were watching the case unfold. One of them, Angela Brooks, a veteran journalist, said, "This woman has what most social campaigns lack: calm in the eye of the storm. We need her." That same day, Justice Forward sent an open letter to Marcus Reed, offering to fund all legal costs and a public campaign if Danielle refused a hush settlement. The letter read, in part, "Moore has accidentally become a symbol, but if she accepts that role, thousands will finally be able to tell their stories without fear of being silenced." Marcus forwarded the letter to Danielle. She read it, then sat for a long time, watching sunlight crawl across the opposite wall. A ripple of anxiety moved through her. She knew stepping into the light meant there was no way back. But she also remembered Margaret Hill's eyes on that flight, eyes that said, "Don't let them silence you." She picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Mr. Reed, tell Justice Forward I accept." The news spread quickly. CNN ran the headline, "Danielle Moore woman at the heart of flying," while Black formally rejects a nearly $500,000 settlement. She will pursue litigation to force systemic change. Across social media, tens of thousands shared the same caption. She isn't fighting for a seat. She's fighting for generations told, "Don't cause trouble." On the other side, Summit's headquarters became a media battleground. Reporters pressed in with the same question: why propose a settlement instead of taking responsibility in the eye of the storm? Vanessa Harper began to understand the crisis had grown beyond her control. At an emergency evening meeting, the CEO snapped, "Ms. Harper, you told me firing Amanda would douse this. Now, what the world is talking about, systemic bias. We need another plan." Vanessa answered quietly, "There's no plan fast enough to patch a hole that's become a canyon." No one replied. They all knew the truth. The airline had lost the one thing that matters in a crisis: trust. That night, in Justice Forward's newsroom, Danielle and Marcus appeared on a live stream. The room was small, the lighting soft, no theatrics, just an honest conversation. Marcus began, "Danielle, many are calling you a symbol. What do you think about that?" She smiled, as if telling an old story. "I don't think I'm a symbol of anything. I'm just someone who was told to leave a seat I legally paid for. But if my speaking up helps others sit in the seats that belong to them, then I'll speak until no one is asked to leave again." Within hours, the line swept the internet, printed on posters, T-shirts, magazine covers. Justice Forward officially launched a campaign called "Seat for All" with Danielle Moore as its central face. Across the country, Vanessa Harper sat alone in an empty conference room, the city's light reflected through frosted glass. She opened her laptop and replayed the recording from that settlement meeting with Danielle. In that moment, she realized perhaps she herself had been part of a system that had forgotten how to bow its head. She closed the lid and exhaled. A thought she didn't expect flickered through. Maybe the world needs more people like her than people like me. 2 months later, when the lawsuit hit federal court, the nation turned to the first hearing between Danielle Moore and Summit Airways. But what no one knew was that, just before the session began, an unexpected witness would appear holding evidence that could change everything. This time, justice wouldn't just be spoken, it would be proven. Morning in Phoenix carried a hint of autumn chill. Inside the modest office of Reed and Associates, Marcus Reed set down a binder nearly 2 inches thick, tapping his fingers on the cover like a drummer keeping time for a tense overture. On the first page, bold letters read "Moore v. Summit Airways, class action pending." Across the table, Danielle Moore sat quietly, hands clasped. Her face no longer bore the fatigue of the early weeks, only the calm focus of someone who'd come too far to turn back. "We're not talking about an incident on a flight anymore," Marcus began, his tone sharp and steady as a gavel. "We're talking about a systemic pattern of misconduct. I intend to turn your story into proof of a culture of bias that Summit allowed to take root." Danielle nodded slightly. She wasn't just representing herself. She'd understood that long ago. In the corner, a monitor showed the video Ethan Reyes had filmed, the 4-minute clip that started it all. Amanda Tate's cold tone, her words dripping with condescension. People like you. Marcus paused the video right at the moment. Amanda pulled back the curtain and pointed toward Coach. This, he said, pointing, is the pivot of our case. That gesture wasn't just rude. It was prejudiced behavior carried out under company authority. We'll prove that Summit didn't just have one Amanda, they built a culture that protected her. Beside him sat Lauren Edwards, a former Summit employee, eyes wary but resolved. She had worked with Amanda for 2 years and had filed at least 3 discrimination complaints, all buried deep in the system. I still have the internal emails, Lauren whispered. My manager told me, don't hurt the company's image. They might have wiped the records, but I have backups. Marcus smiled faintly, the rare smile of a lawyer who just found his silver bullet. In the days that followed, Marcus's office barely slept. A whiteboard in the center bore 4 bold words, pattern and practice. That was the heart of their strategy to transform the narrative from a single incident into a chain of tolerated behavior. Ethan Reyes was called in to testify. It was his first time seeing Danielle since that flight months ago. He brought with him the original hard drive, the unedited footage, including segments he'd never posted Amanda whispering to another attendant right after ejecting Danielle, and Captain Thomas Keller quietly telling a crew member to keep things calm for the company's sake. Marcus watched the footage, then looked at Danielle. You see it? He said softly. This isn't one person's bias. It's the system's compromise. Danielle didn't speak, but hearing her own calm voice in that video, composed, restrained, unwavering, she realized that on that day, her composure had become her strongest weapon. 2 weeks later, the case was officially accepted by the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The headlines lit up. Danielle Moore, the woman removed from first class, officially takes Summit Airways to court. At Summit headquarters, Vanessa Harper slammed the notice onto the table. Her face was taut, yet her eyes carried something that looked almost like acceptance. She muttered to the company's attorneys, "We chose silence for too long. Now, the public will do the talking for us." At the final prep meeting before trial, Marcus drew 3 overlapping circles on the board. 1. Specific event, Flight 482. 2. Repeated behavior, ignored complaints, Lauren's testimony. 3. Organizational culture, Summit's response, firing an individual, dodging accountability. These circles, he said, form what the law calls systemic negligence, a failure built into the structure. He turned to Danielle. You'll be standing before the court, before the public, before hundreds of cameras. They'll cross-examine you. They'll try to rattle you. But remember, you don't have to fight with anger. Just be who you were that day on the plane, calm, clear, and unbowed. Danielle smiled, her eyes bright. Mr. Reed, she said softly, I'm not here to seek revenge. I just want them to see what they've refused to see. The morning of the trial, the grand hall of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse was packed. Reporters elbowed for position, cameras flashed nonstop. Outside, hundreds gathered with banners reading "One Receipt for All" and "Out Justice Forward," chanting her name. Danielle stepped out of the car beside Marcus. No bodyguards, no expensive suit, just a simple gray dress and low black heels. As she walked through the courthouse doors, the crowd's noise faded into a hush, as if the whole city held its breath. Inside, across the aisle, Summit's legal team sat in a dark row of tailored suits. Vanessa Harper was there. Her eyes met Danielle's. No hostility, no avoidance, just two women who had once stood on opposite sides of the same storm. Marcus opened his laptop, cueing the video one last time. When Amanda Tate's pointed gesture appeared on screen, he murmured to himself, "Justice doesn't come from shouting. It comes when the truth is finally seen." The trial began with the plaintiff's statement. Marcus stood before the jury, no theatrics, no raised voice, just the quiet confidence of a man who believed in his case. This isn't about one insulted passenger. It's about a chain of actions ignored, covered, and condoned. Summit Airways created an environment where prejudice could take flight and no one dared to ground it. As Ethan's video played on the courtroom screen, the room fell silent. The image of Danielle standing, calm yet firm, echoed through the hall. Her voice rang out. This isn't over. No one spoke. But something shifted, not just in the jury, but in the air itself, as court recessed. Marcus received a message from an unknown number. "I was a mid-level manager at Summit. I have documents Ms. Harper never saw. Meet me tonight." Marcus glanced at Danielle and nodded slightly. He knew what came next could change everything, not just for this case, but for the entire industry. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the courtroom. It comes from the ones who finally decide not to stay silent. The courtroom was cold and bright. Light from above fell across the long wooden table where Danielle Moore sat beside Marcus Reed, her hands resting neatly on a page of notes, thin, straight lines, like her composure itself. Across from them sat Summit Airways counsel. Between them, the jury, silent, each breath tuned to a day people would reference for years. Marcus opened the examination with his signature calm. He knew this was the pivot, the moment when a single detail could turn the case. And that detail, he believed, lived in the memory and conscience of Captain Thomas Keller, the man who chose silence the day Flight 482 took off. When Keller took the stand, the room fell still. His uniform was immaculate, but his gait no longer carried the iron of a cockpit commander. Marcus rose, voice low, neither adversarial nor ingratiating. "Captain Keller, in Summit's report, you wrote that you verified Ms. Moore's ticket and found an error. Do you recall that?" Keller nodded faintly. "Yes, I do." Marcus stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "Did you, in fact, personally verify that ticket?" A long pause. Keller glanced toward Summit's table where Vanessa Harper clutched a pen, then back to Danielle. He swallowed and spoke, quiet but clear. "No. I relied on the statement of flight attendant Amanda Tate." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Marcus looked to the jury, then back to Keller. "So, you ordered a passenger out of her first-class seat without verifying her ticket." Keller exhaled, eyes down. "Yes, I trusted my employee's judgment." Marcus waited, giving the admission time to settle over every row. "Are you aware that in doing so, you not only failed procedure, you reinforced a dangerous presumption that a black woman isn't entitled to first class unless she proves otherwise?" The air thickened. Keller stared at the floor, blinking fast. "I know, and I regret it." If Keller's confession was the first cut, the video that followed was the finishing blow. On the screen, Amanda Tate appeared during an internal training session 2 years prior, laughing with colleagues. The audio captured by former employee Lauren Edwards had been submitted once before and ignored. Amanda's voice came through, crisp as glass. You know how it is. People like her always find a way into first class somehow. The courtroom froze. 1 beat, 2, then the low stir shock. Jurors glanced at each other. A few shook their heads. Marcus said nothing at first, freezing the frame on Amanda's face. Members of the jury, he began, slow and steady. People like her isn't a throwaway phrase. It's the core of this case prejudice dressed in politeness. It's what forced a passenger from her seat, though she'd done nothing wrong. He looked to the box, eyes warm and unwavering. Danielle Moore wasn't removed because of her ticket. She was removed because her skin color made someone believe she didn't belong. Summit's attorney rose, pushing back. That's a private recording of questionable provenance, and personal remarks don't define company policy. Marcus allowed himself a small, patient smile as if he'd been waiting for that line. Your Honor, if the company truly had zero tolerance for bias, why were 3 complaints about Ms. Tate shelved with instructions to protect the brand? This isn't a lone bad actor. It's institutional neglect. He laid a slim stack before the jury printed emails from Lauren Edwards. Short, bloodless lines, issue handled internally, no further action required, do not escalate, 3 lines, 3 years, 3 chances for Summit to correct course, all ignored. When Marcus finished, he turned to Danielle. She hadn't moved, no frown, no flinch. Something in her gaze made people lower their eyes, a quiet dignity that shamed them into self-reflection. The jury watched her longer than protocol required. They didn't just see a victim. They saw a woman who chose intellect over anger, truth over bitterness. At recess, Vanessa Harper stepped into the corridor and sat hard on a bench, sliding off her glasses. All morning, she hadn't looked away from Danielle. When the video played, Vanessa felt stripped bare. She had chosen silence before signed off on emails that read, "No further action required." Now she understood complicity isn't only in what you do, it's in what you're afraid to refuse. A colleague approached. "You okay?" Vanessa shook her head. "No, but maybe today. I'm not supposed to be." That afternoon, court resumed. Marcus called Lauren Edwards for supplemental testimony. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. She recounted complaints ignored, files closed instead of corrected. "I stayed quiet for too long," Lauren said, hands clasped. "But when I saw Danielle step forward, I realized I couldn't be quiet anymore." The courtroom stayed hushed. In people's eyes, something shifted from skepticism to understanding, from understanding to respect. When the judge's gavel signaled the end of the confrontation, Marcus leaned toward Danielle and murmured, "You've done what few dare you let the country see that justice can begin with composure." Danielle answered simply, "I don't want to win by making them lose. I want them to understand why this can't happen again." Judgment Day drew near. Outside the courthouse, crowds lifted banners, "Justice takes flight." Inside, the jury would soon decide not just for one woman, but for how a society chooses to define fairness. The question was no longer who's right or wrong. It was, how right do we want this world to become that morning? Atlanta's sky was impossibly blue, as if the city itself was holding its breath. In front of the federal courthouse, hundreds gathered, banners waving "Justice takes flight," "Seat for all," and the name Danielle Moore written across white fabric that gleamed in the sun. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The jury filed back in after 2 long days of deliberation. No one spoke, only the sound of shoes against polished wood and the steady tick of a wall clock filled the air. Marcus Reed sat motionless, fingers gripping his pen. Beside him, Danielle looked calm, not the calm of someone certain she'd win, but of someone who had made peace with whatever came next. The judge entered, his voice solemn and resonant. In the case of Moore versus Summit Airways, alleging racial discrimination and violation of civil rights, the jury has reached a verdict. A silence so long it bent time. Then the foreperson rose and read aloud, "We, the jury, unanimously find Summit Airways liable for racial discrimination, and we recommend damages in the amount of $3.5 million U.S. dollars. Furthermore, we advise the court to mandate the airline to implement cultural sensitivity training and establish an independent oversight board for no less than 3 years." The courtroom erupted, not with cheers, but with a kind of collective exhale. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Danielle smiled softly, the smile of someone who understood that justice wasn't about revenge, but healing. Across the aisle, Vanessa Harper lowered her head. Tears slid silently down her face, not out of defeat, but realization. She had stood on the wrong side for far too long. As the judge announced the mandated reforms, Vanessa scribbled something in her notebook. Cultural trainings start with leadership. She knew exactly what her first act would be when she returned to headquarters, in the corner. Amanda Tate, once so proud in her navy blue uniform, sat quietly, saying nothing. After the verdict, Summit released an official statement. Amanda Tate is no longer employed by Summit Airways. Her actions were inconsistent with the company's values and commitments. A short line, cold, final. The end of a career and the closing of a chapter she'd written in arrogance. The media exploded. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post, woman removed from first-class seat. Wins case Summit Airways ordered to reform. Modern flying, while black, no longer a hashtag. It's a national reckoning. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies. Within weeks, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced a federal review into discriminatory patterns in aviation. Change had begun, not from Congress, but from one woman who refused to stay quiet. That afternoon, Danielle stepped before the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters. In her hand was a small folded note, something she'd written the night before. Not a victory speech, just thoughts she'd kept to herself. Her voice was low, steady, untheatrical. "I didn't come here to make anyone kneel. I came to remind us all when one person is treated unjustly. We all lose a piece of our humanity." She paused, glancing at the crowd. Sunlight touched her face, turning her calm into radiance. Today, I didn't just hear the court's verdict. I heard the echo of thousands who've stayed silent. And I hope, from now on, no one ever has to bow their head because of the color of their skin. Applause swelled not celebratory, but reverent, because truth, spoken softly, can be the loudest sound in the world. That evening in Marcus Reed's office, peace hung in the air. Marcus poured her a cup of tea. "I've handled a lot of cases," he said quietly, "but few stay with me the way this one will. You didn't shout yet, everyone heard you." Danielle smiled, eyes on the steam rising between them. because sometimes, she said, justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. Meanwhile, at Summit Airways headquarters in Atlanta, Vanessa Harper convened the first meeting of the Reform Committee. On the whiteboard, she had written, "Respect is not a department, it's a culture." The managers sat silently, listening. Vanessa no longer looked like a crisis manager trying to contain a fire, but a leader trying to rebuild something honest. "We're starting over," she said, "not to save our image, but to earn back the trust we lost." A month later, Amanda Tate appeared in a brief television interview. Gone was the arrogance. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I thought I was just doing my job. But now I understand the greatest duty a person has is not to let prejudice guide their actions. I learned that lesson the hard way." The case of Moore Va. Summit Airways soon entered law school curricula as a landmark example of social justice through procedural reform. The airline complied fully with the court's orders, forming an independent oversight board co-chaired by Justice Forward and rolling out mandatory cultural awareness training for every employee. But beyond the policies and paperwork, the story lived on in homes, classrooms, coffee shops, not as a tale of victory, but as a reminder that one person's calm courage can shift an entire system. That night, back in Phoenix, Danielle sat by the airplane window, her first flight in months. The first-class cabin was quiet, the lights dim. A young white flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "It's an honor to have you on board, Ms. Moore." Danielle nodded, her smile kind. "Thank you. But remember, the true honor is treating every passenger with fairness, not just me." She turned toward the window, watching the city lights shimmer far below, tiny promises glimmering in the dark. Promises that the world, however slowly, was learning to become just a little more right. Time passed, and Moore Va. Summit Airways became a symbol of a new era, proof that justice can live not just in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those who hold their dignity against injustice. A year later, the name Danielle Moore would be heard again, not in a courtroom, but on the national stage in Washington, where she was invited to speak on equality reform in aviation. And there, her story would become a legacy, lighting the way for generations to come. 1 year after the historic verdict in Atlanta, Danielle Moore stepped up to the podium at the National Civil Rights Conference in Washington. D.C. Soft lights fell across her face, the same gentle smile, the same warm, steady voice, now carrying the weight of someone who'd walked through a storm and learned to retell it with grace. Behind her, a simple backdrop read, "Justice is a Journey." The hall was packed attorneys, journalists, people who'd faced discrimination in every corner of life: aviation, healthcare, education. But when Danielle began to speak, the room grew so quiet you could hear people breathe. "I used to think justice was a destination, a place where you win and someone else loses. But walking out of that courtroom last year, I realized justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins the moment you choose to stand up, and it keeps going, day after day, in how we treat one another." She paused, eyes moving across the crowd where Marcus Reed sat, smiling with quiet pride. Farther back, Vanessa Harper was there too, not looking away, but showing up like a new ally for reform. After the speech, headlines echoed the same line: Danielle Moore from victim to pathbreaker. Her story no longer lived inside a single airline. It spilled into other fields. Service companies, tech giants, even public hospitals launched cultural awareness programs, citing Moore v. Summit Airways as a turning point for change. A podcast series called Seat for All took off, with Danielle interviewing people who'd faced bias. In one episode, she spoke to a hospital worker discriminated against for her South American accent. When they make you feel like you don't belong. Remember, your existence is the proof that you have a right to be there. That line spread quickly across social media, becoming a motto for Justice Forward 2.0, a campaign she and Marcus launched to keep corporate reforms honest. A few months later, an unexpected invitation arrived the U.S. Senate Civil Rights Committee asked Danielle Moore to testify before Congress on implicit bias in aviation. The day she walked into the Capitol, cameras lined the halls. Unlike her first encounter with the public, Danielle now moved with the steadiness of someone who knew she belonged. A senator asked Ms. Moore, "If you could say one thing to the people writing our laws, what would it be?" Danielle smiled, no theatrics. "Just truth. Don't write laws only to prevent mistakes. Write them to encourage us to treat each other the way we want to be treated." Silence fell for a few beats. Then the room rose in applause, not for rhetoric, but for sincerity spoken plainly. That night in her D.C. hotel room, Danielle opened her laptop to find hundreds of messages. A single mother in Chicago wrote that a banker had refused her a loan because she didn't look trustworthy, but after hearing Danielle's story, she filed a formal complaint. A young flight attendant from Denver sent a photo of her first Cultural Sensitivity 101 session with the caption, "Our airline finally launched this thank you." Danielle read each note, quietly, for a long time. Then she laughed softly, not with pride, but with the realization that her greatest achievement wasn't winning a lawsuit, it was awakening courage in other people. A week later, on her flight back to Phoenix, she sat by the window in first class. The attendant that day was a young white woman with bright eyes and a gentle voice. When she set down the drink, she hesitated, then said softly, "Moore, thank you, because of your story. Our airline added equity training. I've learned to listen before I judge." Danielle smiled, accepting the glass. "Thank you. But remember, real change doesn't come from the courtroom. It comes from moments like this." The attendant nodded, eyes shining. She added, "I dreamed of being a flight attendant to meet the world. Now I understand meeting the world means honoring the many worlds inside every person." Danielle turned to the window, clouds drifting beneath the wing. This time, the sky didn't summon memories of injustice. It felt like a reminder justice doesn't need to fly high. It just needs to travel far enough to reach another heart. When she landed, a message from Marcus Reed was waiting. "A new congressional task force wants you on their standing advisory panel. Looks like the journey isn't over." She replied with a single emoji, a closed, steady fist, because she knew this fight no longer belonged to her alone. The next month, Vanessa Harper published an essay in The Atlantic, "I Stayed Silent," and that was my failure. She described her awakening learning that real power isn't controlling a narrative, but facing the truth. It ended with one line: Danielle Moore didn't just change the company, she changed me. 3 years later, Danielle Moore's name was etched into the Civil Rights Hall of Honor at the Smithsonian, alongside pathbreakers like Rosa Parks and Maya Angelou. When invited to speak, Danielle said, "I'm not a hero. I'm someone who was told to leave a seat and decided not to leave what was right." The room stood not to applaud Danielle, but the humanity she represented, a quiet, durable courage. That night, back at her hotel, Danielle opened the old notebook where she'd once written through the hardest days of the case. With a blue pen, she added one last line: "Justice doesn't end when you win. It truly begins when you use that win to clear the way for someone else." She closed the notebook, turned out the light, and smiled in the dark, the smile of someone who knows that sometimes victory isn't getting a first-class seat. It's helping the world believe that everyone deserves a fair seat on this flight we call life. The story, Flight Attendant Forces Black Woman Out of First Class. 7 minutes later, she gets karma. Is not just about a fair verdict. It's a profound reminder of the power of dignity and wisdom in the face of injustice. Danielle Moore, the woman forced out of her first-class seat, chose not to respond with anger or resentment. She didn't let humiliation turn her into someone reactive. Instead, she used calm and reason to transform insult into reform. Through the way she handled it, an entire system was forced to change, and thousands of others found the courage to speak up. The greatest message here is this: justice doesn't only live in courtrooms, it begins in how we choose to act. When we respond with wisdom, we don't just defend ourselves, we pave the way for a fairer society. And sometimes, what changes the world isn't the loudest voice, but a person brave enough to stay calm in the storm. If you've ever been judged for your skin color, background, or social class, remember, your worth isn't defined by where you sit, but by how you stand tall in the face of unfairness. Thank you for watching this story with us. If you believe that justice begins with empathy and humanity, please like and share to spread this message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart, awaken awareness, and remind us all that respect is a right that belongs to everyone.